critical. Sorry, we just had a voice appear from somewhere. It's particularly critical within the Pacific. So we welcome Gabby and Meiapo to join us. People often don't think about disaster and emergency laws in the middle of an emergency, but we all know that they form a really important foundation and framework for disaster risk management. So we really look forward to hearing from you, Gabby, and we'll make sure that we leave space for questions at the end of the presentation as well. So thank you very much and welcome everyone. Okay, so Gabby, we'll hand over to you, and Luke, we'll start the presentation.
Wonderful. So kia ora everyone, lovely to be connected to New Zealand. So a big thank you to Aaron, to Josie and Luke and the team at CID for inviting us along to provide one of these CID talks. So my name is Gabby Emery, as introduced by Aaron, and I work with the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Societies in the Disaster Law team, and I am based in our regional office in Kuala Lumpur, where we support the work of 38 national Red Cross Red Crescent societies in this region and in a range of activities. Obviously, judging from my backdrop, you'll see that we are currently in lockdown here, so I am working from home at the moment, and I'm really pleased to be joined by my great colleague today, Meiapo Faasau, who is our Pacific Disaster Law Manager, and he is based in our team in Suva and working with across the Pacific region. You will hear from Meia a little bit later on because we are tag teaming this presentation. So I'm going to just kick off, giving a little bit of an overview about what is disaster law, why the Red Cross Red Crescent is working in this area, and also how this relates to the global and regional frameworks. I will then pass over to my colleague Meia, who will talk a little bit more in depth about some of the work in the region, some of the challenges, some of the lessons learned, and then we will have time for a discussion as well and to answer any of your questions. So Luke, if you could change to the next slide, please. Great. So we never start one of these talks without just first introducing the movement and introducing what part of the movement we're talking on. I know it can get super confusing because there's lots of different moving parts of the Red Cross Red Crescent family. So Meia and I today are talking to you and representing the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So that's on your left-hand side there of that cross. And we are the part of, so obviously as our name suggests, we are the secretariat for the 192 National Red Cross Red Crescent societies globally, and we support our member societies on non-conflict related issues. So in terms of like health issues, disasters, climate emergencies, and also longer term development. We also have at the top of the cross there, the International Committee of the Red Cross, who you may be familiar with their work both around international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and also their work for preparedness and response to conflict-related emergencies. And where the real work gets done is with our 192 Red Cross Red Crescent societies who you will know the work of New Zealand Red Cross, obviously in New Zealand, and the work of their various Pacific national societies. And they are domestic bodies that are set up in a very localized way, have a huge volunteer network, and also have this unique kind of status in their own domestic settings where they're auxiliaries to their public authorities in the humanitarian field. And what this will look like in each setting will be different according to the humanitarian needs and the priorities of the context they're working in. But often in the Pacific, for example, you will see national societies have a recognized or formalized role on issues of disaster response and first aid and health. In New Zealand, obviously, New Zealand Red Cross also plays a big role in the migration space as well. So the national societies are recognised in their domestic context, normally through a legal base, which is a Red Cross Red Crescent law. And what we see in the Pacific as well is, you know, most of those national societies also have a recognised role in their disaster management laws as well as first responders. I have states parties at the bottom there, and that's because of this unique role of the Red Cross Red Crescent that's been recognised both in international and national law. We get together with the 194 states parties to the Geneva Conventions every 4 years, where we discuss, we negotiate, and we set the humanitarian mandate for the next 4 years through the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And one of these areas that we have been discussing with states, and we have also formalized our role with and set the mandate for, is the area of disaster law. So we have been, Luke, if you can change the slide, please. We have been working on disaster laws since 2007, where we had one of these kind of soft law or international resolutions passed at one of these conferences. And as Aaron said in his opening remarks, you know, what's law got to do with it? It's certainly not, it's not the first thing that might come to mind when you're thinking about emergency or disaster response. But law, and I think we've really seen this reflected in the COVID-19 pandemic as well, has got a critical role to play, and it really is, you know, underlying all aspects of a really good disaster risk management or emergency management system. It clarifies who should be doing what and by when, the roles and responsibilities, how coordination should work, and also how, you know, those laws and protective measures should really include and protect the most at risk of these emergencies. Next slide, please. So as I said, the Red Cross has been working on these issues since actually 2003 is when we first started looking into it. And then we had the agreement from governments who mandated our work in this area in 2007. But the first area we started to work in was an area called IDRL, or International Disaster Response Law. We were specifically looking at legal preparedness for international disaster assistance, and looking at how international efforts and regional efforts can better complement those domestic efforts and plug into that domestic system, because we were finding all sorts of kind of confusion and lack of clarity on how international actors and domestic actors were meant to work together in disaster response settings. Over time, and because of, you know, the different issues now facing the world, and because of the various kind of different global commitments like Sendai and the SDGs, we're also starting to look into other areas as well about how to ensure that we reduce the risk of natural hazards becoming disasters in the first place. So we're looking at areas such as climate and disaster risk reduction in law, disaster preparedness and response law, so really looking at domestic systems, and due to COVID as well, we've also started some really interesting work now on looking at what laws you need to better prepare for and reduce the risk of public health emergencies. So at least in Asia Pacific, we've worked in all of the Asia Pacific countries actually. We've passed or revised or supported law change and disasters in over half of Asia Pacific countries, and we also have a lot of processes ongoing. So today, Meiapo will be talking to you about some of that specific work in the Pacific. Next slide, please. Luke, if you could, yeah. Great, so unlike the international humanitarian law that you may have heard a lot about, or the kind of body of hard law that exists for times of conflict, there's actually no such kind of treaty that exists at the moment for times of disaster response, or by those kind of emergencies caused by natural hazards or climate issues. However, that's not to say that nothing exists, and there's lots of different kind of sources of both, you know, hard binding law and also soft kind of international policy law that we can look at when we're talking about disasters. So I'll talk a little bit next about some of the global frameworks, but I mentioned obviously our work in Red Cross and Red Crescent on disaster law. So soft law, it's not binding, but it certainly, you know, sets a lot of the international policy. We have a lot of UN resolutions that our diplomats are busy negotiating every year through, say, the UN humanitarian resolutions and ECOSOC. We have bilateral agreements between countries saying how they will work together in disaster management or in emergency situations. I know New Zealand likely has a lot of MOUs or agreements with Pacific neighbours in this area. We have a growing and very interesting area of regional law, of really guiding how regional governments or governments in certain regions and partners will coordinate and collaborate in times of disasters. So we have some really interesting examples of hard or binding treaty law in Asia Pacific and ASEAN. And we also have, and Maya will talk about this a little bit more too, we also have some developments in this area in the Pacific as well. We obviously have sectoral law, like international sectoral law in different areas around disaster response, like they're a little bit kind of niche around Tampere Convention and Kyoto Convention for customs arrangements and things. And we have different bodies of law like international humanitarian law, human rights law, environmental law that also have some reflections and some relevance to disaster management as well. So that's the kind of international framework. I talked about these global agendas. We're all very aware that, you know, the world is striving towards meeting the commitments that they've made in the 2030 global agendas. So we have the Sustainable Development Goals for the kind of overarching development area. We also have, you know, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, looking at reducing risk from disasters. And we also have the Paris Agreement for climate change. And these, you know, they're certainly looking at how all of these frameworks can be more coherent at the international level. But what we're seeing is that there's still quite a fragmented approach taken around these agendas, and that fragmentation is certainly translating down to the national and the local levels as well. So we're seeing how some of these frameworks or the responsible ministries might be your National Planning Ministry or National Development Ministry or your NDMOs for the Sendai framework or your Ministries of Environment for the climate change. And it's really important because what a lot of these global agendas are trying to do is very much the same thing, but we're seeing this fragmentation and duplication, which is also translating and causing confusion down at the community level. So if you push the next button. And just to overlay on that, if that wasn't confusing enough, now we have a massive pandemic, global pandemic on that as well. And we're needing to also see that these frameworks also need to be coordinating with and talking to international and public health issues as well. So, I mean, that can all be boggling, you know, we are humans after all, and it's hard to kind of get coordination and cohesion working. And it can certainly be boggling when we're looking at that global level and how to make it work at the local level. But what we see as well is a really good place to start, and the most important place to start is at that community level, because when you look at those global frameworks, the one thing that they all have in common is they're talking about the needing to empower and to build resilience at the community level. So if we kind of turn our way that we need to look at these global frameworks and saying, okay, well, you know, what needs to be built at this community or this local level to ensure that they've got resilience to whatever type of disaster or whatever type of development shock that they might face, then this is the place to start. Next slide. And this is certainly the approach that is taken in the Pacific, which is wonderful. And I think really hats off to the Pacific regional leaders who have come together to say, okay, well, how can we take a more coherent and integrated approach to our development through the framework for resilient development in the Pacific, which Meiapo will be talking a little bit more in his remarks, and also the BOE Declaration for Action as well, which is looking more at a security way of looking at, but also looking at this kind of integrated approach between disasters, climate and health issues as well. And just before I leave you for this little part, so where we see where rubber really hits the road, it's wonderful having all of these international and regional commitments, but really all of that doesn't mean much unless it's implemented and thought about and framed at the domestic level. So it's really, really key that lawmakers, policymakers and their partners start to look at, you know, how do we make sure that we have kind of resilient frameworks and frameworks that are as coherent as possible down in our national and our local context? And that's really what we've been working with governments in the Pacific on to try to achieve, particularly through our DRM and climate change adaptation. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague Meiapo, who can talk us through some of the work in the Pacific.
Thank you very much, Gabby. Just sound check whether you can hear me, please. Yes, so this next part of the session is just to look at the impact of the work that we're doing within the Pacific at the regional level, right down to the community level. Thank you very much. Next slide. So as you can see, there is presence of national societies all over the Pacific. And these national societies have been recognized by legislation by their national government as humanitarian auxiliary organizations to government. So they support the capacity of government to respond to disasters, as well as in other areas of health programming within the Pacific region. So if you can look at the map that you have before you, we have a standalone IFRC support office within Papua New Guinea. We have a standalone office up in the North Pacific to help our North Pacific Island countries. And of course, we operate out of Suva for the Pacific down in the South. A lot of the laws that relate to the auxiliary role of national societies are either standalone piece of legislation, or it is also set out in sectorial legislation, both health as well as laws that govern emergency response or emergency risk management. Thank you very much. So before you, you have some of the more recent pieces of work that we've been working on. So you can see there the support that was provided with regards to the review of the Vanuatu legislation. And of course, as pointed out by colleagues earlier, law formulation is not really one of the things that you look at in times of disasters. You may be looking at regulations, or you may be looking at rapid response laws that are promulgated for that temporary period. But a number of the laws, when you really look at detailed reviews, it is post-disasters. So you can see there that Cyclone Pam really brought the attention of the Vanuatu government to updating their legislation. So the Fiji review as well, we are supporting Fiji legislation since 2018, and we were hoping that it would be read in Parliament this year. However, with a number of COVID operations going on, as well as multiple responses to other disasters within Fiji, we are postponing some of the components of the consultations, which is very important to ensuring that it is passed. So again, looking at the map before you, you can also see the number of countries that we have supported with regards to disaster law research projects. So we had the IDRL piece of work, which was launched last year, which looks at the capacity of the 18 Pacific Island countries to support regulation of incoming international assistance at the same time, to cooperate and coordinate with each other within the region to support access as well as multiple country coordination in times of disasters. Currently, we have about 10 Pacific governments who are looking at law processes in relation to their disasters, as well as their auxiliary role laws for their national societies, trying to strengthen it in terms of preparedness for future disasters. And these are at variable levels, and we can touch more about on that in a different slide later. Thank you. So these are some of the key things that have come out of a number of these reviews. So if you can look on the board there, the law review for Fiji, we've really supported that since 2018 in terms of providing technical assistance. And of course, when you see the disaster law team in terms of reviewing laws, We may be the frontliners in this particular aspect of the work that IFRC does, but behind us, we have a number of different experts in the field of disaster response or disaster risk management. So we have those who work in the field of inclusivity, BGI, gender inclusivity in programming. We have health specialists, we have shelter specialists, we have disaster risk management coordinators, and a number of these colleagues are the ones that we look to for technical assistance or advice in terms of moving these processes within government forward. Kiribati, most recently, Kiribati has passed legislation with regards to integration of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, excuse me for that. So they passed the Kiribati Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Act in 2019, which takes an integrated approach to climate change and disaster risk management. Within Samoa, we supported inclusivity and strengthening provisions within their plan with regards to protection and inclusion. For Vanuatu, we looked at a localized preparedness and response approach, which really supported the work that they did during COVID-19 operations. And this was looking at national down to subnational, all the way down to the community level in terms of coordination. Currently, we are also providing support to Papua New Guinea in the review of their disaster law. Thank you. So currently, with the engagement that we've had with the Pacific Island Forum, one of the key outcomes within the Pacific is looking at the engagement within the framework for resilient development in the Pacific. So you have the 3 goals there in front of you, but one of the latest developments is having 4 pillars, which support integration, inclusion, information, so informing the public in terms of communication, and looking at sustaining of the various assistances that are being given out. A big part of this engagement by the IFRC with the FRDP is advocacy for regional disaster response mechanism at the regional level. And this was a long time ago. We were told to wait for FRDP to come into place. And we are still supporting FRDP at the same time. We're also supporting the Board Declaration, and we'll come to the Board Declaration mechanism a bit later in the presentation. Thank you. So this is one of the key things that really strengthens the engagement that we have within the Pacific, and that is the community level engagement by our volunteers, as well as our Red Cross national societies, right down to their branches, which are based within the vulnerable communities. So we bring that to light, a number of these issues that they go through. So within the Red Cross community, we have a vulnerability and a capacity assessment. So this assessment informs the needs of the different communities down at the community level. So it's specific, and at the same time, it's also kind of like specialized for each specific island community. This also informs the way we support countries with regards to ensuring that the solutions we provide in the legislation, as Gabby pointed out earlier, we started out focusing on international aid regulation, but now we're more engaged in ensuring that we support preparedness, all phases of disasters, right down to the community level, and ensuring that there is a voice from down at the community level, going right up to national, and there is a joint buy-in from national down to subnational, all the way down to community in terms of putting together the different mechanisms that they require to put within a legal framework. So aside from the legislation, we also support advocacy in terms of policy and regulations when those are required, and ensuring that it's a holistic approach to disaster risk management. Thank you very much, Gabby. Apologies. So that last slide sets out some of the legal frameworks we have in place and the strength of the laws that they may have. So as you can see, currently, so Australia has different sectorial pieces of legislation that govern different types of risks, and then they are coordinated at the end in relation to their functions and roles, but there is no set piece that actually brings them all together or consolidates or coordinates. For Palau, they have in place an executive order. So this executive order repealed the previous executive order, and the details are set out within the National Disaster Risk Management frameworks. So the current framework they have in place is the 2016 framework, which is a subsidiary piece of legislation. The issue with some of these setups is if you don't have a principal law that dictates the powers or the authority of your coordinator or your controller in times of disasters, he will be questioned or she will be questioned when it comes times to operationalize or to respond. And this can sometimes really make it difficult to have a coordinated as well as rapid response in times of disasters. So looking at the post-2000 modern DRMX, apologies, there was an oversight on my side. When you're looking at the older DRMX part, Kiribati should be moving from there to this particular column. So as pointed out before, Kiribati passed their law in 2019, taking an integrated approach to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, as well as Vanuatu, who passed their law in 2019. However, for Vanuatu, the assent was given in 2019, but it commenced in 2020. And then you would have Tonga, who are currently still reviewing their current law, which was passed in 2007. Samoa was 2007 as well. New Zealand 2002. Nauru in 2016, which is also one of the newer pieces of legislation that takes it right down from national to community level, subnational level. Then you have Cook Islands, which was 2007. And currently we've been hearing that Niue is also undertaking review of their current existing laws. So on the right, you have some of the laws there that are a bit older. So again, just because it's old doesn't mean that it's fit for the current purpose. However, because of the dated time as well as the concepts that are in there, it needs to be updated or reviewed in order to take into consideration the new terminologies and the new technologies that we are now using in this day and age. So some of these laws that we have with the colleagues in the older DRMX, they may not have provisions in there that cater for disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management. Thank you very much. And we'll touch more on a number of these in other slides later on. Thank you, Gabby.
Great, yeah, thank you, May. And I'm just gonna present on a couple of slides here. And these are some of common disaster law issues we see in the Pacific, but I'm just going to premise this by saying, actually, we see these globally as well. So it's really important that when governments are looking to review their legislation, that a lot of consideration and focus are given to these kind of issues as well. So we're seeing, and particularly some of these older acts, that, you know, a lot of the focus was on response. So very much a reactive approach to, you know, how to respond. But as we know, and we're seeing a much more focus and emphasis needs to also be given to how this machinery and these mechanisms work to reduce risk from these disasters happening in the first place. And, you know, as Maya said, you know, having this priority focus on DRR and legislation is definitely key. That's really what Sendai Framework's all about. But even more important than that is making sure sectorial legislation really embodies DRR. So that's making sure things like your land use plans, your building codes, even things like, you know, your health legislation is thinking about disasters and also thinking about how those institutions and systems are looking at how to reduce disaster risk and thinking of those long-term climate change implications as well. Law plays a really critical role for bringing people together, both to prepare, reduce risk, and respond to a disaster. And one of the key roles for law is really needing to be very, very clear on how that coordination works. What are the roles and responsibilities of the different sectors across the different phases, both across government, and also from that central level to the subnational level to make sure those information systems and those coordination systems work effectively. It's, you know, you don't want to be arguing about or having confusion about this in times of a disaster. And it was very interesting to see that this is one of the big learnings that came out of the review of New Zealand's CDM Act as well, around needing to get that coordination working between national and subnational level. But of course, looking at the next box, you know, this is not just a role for government, it is an all of society approach, you know, around disaster risk management or climate change adaptation, everyone has a role to play. So it's also really key that some of those non-government agencies are also mandated, are included in decision making, be that, you know, science bodies, be that, you know, civil society, NGOs, be that, you know, representative groups for, you know, at risk or particularly vulnerable populations. They should also be mandated to be involved in that decision making. Next, looking at multi-hazard and sectorial integration. What are we seeing right now? You know, we can get any type of emergency. No longer is it just thinking about, you know, cyclones or earthquakes. We now also have to be considering public health emergencies and different types of disasters as well. You know, we're seeing more and more droughts and slow onset disasters in the Pacific as well. So how is, you know, that working not only in your disaster management legislation, but also in different sectors and different legislation as well? And again, you know, I think, you know, with the climate crisis and these newer types of maybe emergencies that we're seeing, these slow onset emergencies, you know, a lot of our systems are geared up for these kind of rapid onset types of disasters. But how do we get our mechanisms and our machinery working, and we can get, you know, social protection mechanisms or funding out or declarations for slower onset disasters like droughts? You know, when do you push that button, and how does then the government and the non-government machinery react? The next box there is around protection and inclusion. Laws shouldn't, and policies are not there just about setting up institutions and systems. They're, you know, ostensibly there for protecting and including people. What we find is that our laws and policies are usually just have very aspirational statements, you know, around, you know, at risk or vulnerability. But really, we've found that in order for action to happen on the ground, they need to really spell out and be quite specific what needs to happen for each group, you know. So unless it's written there and it's detailed, maybe it's not going to happen. So, you know, what exactly needs to happen for persons with disabilities? Who is responsible? What needs to happen in terms of SGBV and disasters? Who is responsible for making that happen? So that also needs to be clear. Funding. So law is very important for making sure that funding is mandated and it's set, and that funding shouldn't just be there for response, but we're seeing some really good examples of how you can allocate through law funding for disaster risk reduction. So we're seeing some great examples from Philippines, how they've set 5% of their budget for disaster risk reduction, and all local councils must, you know, set aside 5% of their budget to reduce disaster risk. International assistance, we'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of the Pacific, but we, you know, in times of a large-scale disaster, there are lots of legal issues that can arise. We saw it even in New Zealand's context in Christchurch, with lots of legal and regulatory issues arising for how international teams could support in a domestic country, and the same arises in every country. So it's really important that that's clear, that international providers know how to work in a country, what are the rules and regulations, and how they can effectively plug into that system as well. And the final one is awareness and implementation. Law is no good if it just sits on a shelf and no one understands their rights, roles, and responsibilities underneath it. So it's really important that this awareness and this education, and everyone kind of understands how that works and the role they have to play. Next slide. Okay. And next slide again. So we'll just talk about some of these issues in the Pacific. So we have done a lot of work in the Pacific looking at the connection between disaster risk management, DRR, and climate change adaptation work in the Pacific. And what we found is that really, you know, we keep hearing these words around needing to make sure that our disaster management frameworks are climate smart. But what does that mean? You know, climate smart, it sounds like a bit of a jargon, but it really means taking this long-term vision, you know, looking out not just for 5 years, but looking out for 20 years, looking out for 50 years. And making sure that, you know, we are planning for that long-term vision and that we're using, you know, scientific information to inform our decisions. It's talking about a lot of things I just talked about before around governance, around it's not just for your National Disaster Management Office, or it's not just for your Ministry of Environment, but it's for all of those sectors of government that they also need to be around the table and making sure that this is included in their planning. Again, this global, regional to local, I mean, coming together, you know, at the UN and making treaties and making these commitments is wonderful, but, you know, it can't stop there. We're seeing that the rates of implementation are still really low, and we're still seeing in the Pacific, when we look past, you know, these wonderful commitments that are taken in the FRDP, there's still a lot of work to make it work at the national and the local level. And this is where I think over the next, you know, 5 years, this is where the efforts have to be no more kind of regional dialogues, but actually implement the commitments that have now been made and make that work for the country contexts. Again, this fragmentation, we're seeing a lot of it in the Pacific. And I think, you know, because of the siloed approach of climate and a lot of the money it's bringing, we're seeing a lot of fragmentation because of funding opportunities in the Pacific. So we are seeing quite a lot of climate change institutions and mechanisms actually set up under ministries of finance, rather than that kind of connection with, you know, the agencies that are being able to implement at the national level. So it's really at the community level. So it's really important that there's kind of a coherent approach taken in the Pacific, and that those powers and that authority and that funding also is not just sitting in the capitals, but also going down into the villages as well, because, you know, at the local level, they know what's best for the communities they serve. And again, making sure what Maya talked about before is that some of those most vulnerable and at-risk groups have, you know, are included in decision-making and their needs taken into account. So that's around some of the climate work. Maya, do you have anything that you want to jump in on that? I can't hear you, so we'll just jump to the next one. Okay, and this is just really about, you know, stressing this need around protection, inclusion, and really to spell out as well what needs to be done, you know, so moving from beyond aspirational statements of taking a human rights-based approach to really, you know, going into detail about what that means, you know, and what are the specific needs and the rights that need to be included in those frameworks as well. So we mentioned this protection inclusion element, and, you know, I just want to point out this good example from Samoa, where they, in their National Disaster Management Plan, they have really detailed provisions around sexual and gender-based violence and disasters. So they actually have a subgroup, a protection group working in this area, and they have quite detailed provisions on how this work will collaborate, the role of Samoa Red Cross, the role of the police, how that will be coordinated by the NDMO. So they're the kind of provisions we're looking at when we're talking about protection and inclusion. I have talked about displacement. You know, we might have seen the recent headlines that, you know, there is more displacement now caused by disasters and climate change than conflict. You know, so we realize that this is a huge and growing, it could be, you know, one of the biggest humanitarian challenges of the 21st century. But when we go to actually look at the laws and policies around disasters and climate change, they're very silent on this issue. So, you know, if we really want to be able to, you know, reduce the risk of or take action around displacement, we need to be able to also task it. We need to be able to give, you know, agencies authority and mandates for it. So we really need to give a lot more thought to this area. Next slide. So I'll just start off on this area and then pass to Maya. So I talked about before that since the middle of last year, we've been looking at law and public health emergencies, because we saw that globally, you know, laws have played a critical role in the COVID-19 response. Some countries have done a much better job, but we are seeing a lot of countries also using this as an opportunity as well for kind of power grabs and kind of very reactive lawmaking as well. And this is really concerning. So it's very important that more thought is given to what we need to do to prepare our laws and policies for public health emergencies, so we don't get into the situation of kind of reactive lawmaking. So what we've found, we've done a project globally, and we're also doing a more detailed project in 8 Pacific countries around, what actually is the synergy between disaster management and health laws, because we were seeing that, there has been a lot of confusion about how these two systems would need to work together. So we're seeing a lot of health laws normally have the powers for health declarations. They might have, the public health measures. But we're seeing that disaster management mechanisms were being utilized for coordination purposes. But how that played out, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, caused a lot of confusion. It caused a lot of power struggles as well. So there was confusion about who should lead between the health ministry and the NDMO. Meia could talk a little bit more about that as well. So we're really seeing this need for more clearly articulated roles and responsibilities, and also I think something in the Pacific as well as these prolonged states of emergency as well. Like having prolonged states of emergency is never something that we would advocate for because of how they could impinge on civil liberties as well. So I think more thought has to be given to how we can manage public health emergencies without kind of long states of emergencies in play as well. But Meia, you're much closer to the action in the Pacific on this one, so over to you.
Thank you very much, Gabby. Definitely, yes, a fair amount of confusion along that area in terms of who takes the lead and who does what. And of course, it got even more difficult when you had natural disasters that occurred during the time. In some countries, as you could see, I guess it was because of the fact that they had undergone issues with epidemics. So for instance, Samoa, they had no questions whatsoever as to the next action. And from that response to the measles within Samoa, they actually kind of had a fair idea of coordination in terms of when COVID happened, as well as looking forward to other disasters or multiple disasters that occur at the same time. So definitely this is an area, as Gabby pointed out, that a number of countries will come back after COVID and have a look at. And even at this very moment, they are having a lot of discussions over it, because normally when you have natural disasters in the Pacific, you will have outbreaks that follow afterwards, basically types of diseases that are linked to the use of water. However, in this particular area, it was actually the key emergency was not so much those outbreaks post-disaster, it was actually COVID-19 itself. But perhaps we'll touch more on the regional approach in the next slide, please. Thank you. So again, we had undertaken this study back in 2019, and it was launched early 2019. We had to fast track it being finalized because of the prevalence and emergence of COVID-19 within the Pacific. And we shared the study with colleagues who were looking at putting in place a humanitarian response mechanism for the Pacific. So definitely the study, we hope, was of great use. But aside from the study itself, we had interventions at the international level with regards to what they came out of it afterwards. And we'll touch on that a bit later. But currently, as pointed out by this particular slide, there is no permanent regional response mechanism in the Pacific for disasters. So you have the FRDP, which looks at integrated approach to DRR and climate change, as well as strengthening of legal infrastructure, understanding of roles and responsibilities. And then you have Boyd Declaration, which actually states that natural disasters within its preamble are is one of the security risks to Pacific, but identifying NCDs as well as climate change, and climate change in particular as the #1 security risk within the Pacific. However, upon closer look at Board Declaration, our colleagues within the region from Pacific Island Forum and the Pacific community realized that the actual mechanism for response lay under an older declaration, which was the Biketawa Declaration, which was then used to put into place the Pacific Island PHBC protocols, which we'll come to a bit later. What this actually outlines is that there is a need to set out coordination mechanisms within your current disaster legislation. And you need to have future thinking provisions now, because we are no longer just looking internally, you are now looking regional. And there has been examples of deployments from Fiji, from New Zealand, from Australia, as well as from Tonga and other various Pacific Island countries doing peer-to-peer support. However, when you look at the legal facilities, which are set out in their different pieces of legislation, there is actually an ad hoc process in place in terms of promulgating regulations, mirror or doing response itself. There is a need, however, to have these pieces of laws set out a bit more clearly way in advance, so that when you are responding, you know the standards with which you should respond under and the quality of whatever it is that you bring in that it needs to adhere to, as well as ensuring that your responders have the necessary qualifications or capacity required within the countries. And then you have reciprocating provisions within the country that you are supporting or other countries that you might be looking at allowing to your borders that provide these necessary legal facilities. So when we're talking about legal facilities, you can look at the part that on the slide before you that deals with regulatory issues. So it's basically facilities in relation to customs clearance, facilities in relation to ensuring that humanitarian aid is fast track coming in, looking at the qualifications of those who are responding, ensuring that they are able to arrive and carry out the life-saving work that they need to carry out. And of course, keeping in mind that 72 hours is the amount of time that you can really minimize within that window, the loss of life in times of disasters. You have to be within the country and operating immediately. And then other issues as pointed out within this slide, humanitarian visas or work permit waivers or provisions within the legislation that can change your visa from a tourism visa to a work permit or some kind of humanitarian work permit that allows you to work within wherever it is that you are to support the response efforts. And of course, there is always a need to ensure that it is local driven, it is local coordinated, and that you always have the local actors in the driver's coordinating the responses that are coming in from overseas to ensure that whatever responses are given adhere to traditional, the local customs and traditions and standards within the country. Thank you very much. To the next slide. So a bit more on the Pacific Humanitarian COVID-19 protocols. So this protocol was brought about after discussions within the Pacific in relation to ensuring and allowing the movement of aid consignments in times of COVID-19. So specifically, we were looking at humanitarian consignments that deal with PPEs. So the health related like masks, as well as other safety equipment that was needed by frontline agencies to respond to COVID-19. So out of these discussions, they had a ministerial action group, which actually were the ones that were chairing the particular discussions. And then you have a regional group or team that was made up from the different group agencies. So we're looking at customs, we're looking at immigration, the biosecurity, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, as well as the Pacific Community. They came together and they put together standards that each country was to look at in terms of ensuring the movement of these goods, as well as facilitating the movement of humanitarian actors. And a number of these standards adhered to international standards as well. So you see before you the protocols that were put into place, looking at facilitation of receiving and deployment of technical teams, looking at requirements for customs and biosecurity clearance to be facilitated, looking at immigration processes to ensure expedited clearance of colleagues who are humanitarian responders, and then looking at putting in place provisions for repatriation. And of course, discussion on diplomatic clearances. So a number of these different protocols, at some point, we invite you to please look at a bit closer with regards to the tools that we outlined in the beginning through Gabby's presentation. You will see that we have a model IDRL law there, and it sets out the facilitation of these different areas at the national level. And this, of course, was out of a number of years of responding and facilitating responding across the whole world. So some of the best practices that came out of those discussions really support this, so that you can ensure that your national law can actually facilitate all these different protocols when it comes down to implementation. One of the key things that we did for Fiji when the protocols were released was we tried to get together a working group. So a working group that was formulated, which consisted of customs, immigration, or actually implement the different protocols before you within this table. And we had a look at their different processes, their different risk management, and try to get over the red tape or the sectoral divide with regards to their processes in order to actually try and ensure that they can be able to work together in an expeditious manner, at the same time not foregoing the different risks that they themselves manage at the border. So talking about biosecurity, flora and fauna, invasive species, or other types of diseases that can harm the agricultural market, customs. We're looking at consignments that can have certain smuggled contraband in there, as well as fake medicines, etc., etc. And of course, looking at the deployment of technical teams, allowance for their equipment, and whatever else they need to be brought in that might not be allowed under the existing pharmaceutical regulations within the different countries. And I guess with that, we'll be taking questions, and we look forward to the different questions that you may have. But it brings us to a small summary of our discussions today. We'd like to leave you with a short video from around the Pacific, summarizing a number of different issues and concepts that we just presented on today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mea and Gabby. We would like to invite people to ask some questions, and in particular, we have a question from, why can I not see that? Sorry, I'd like to, excuse me, invite anyone to ask some questions, and in particular, Audrey, you asked a question. I'd like to invite you to unmute and speak to the question directly if you might be able to.
Well, thank you very much, and my thanks to the presenters and Talofa Faasau. I guess the question I had really was a coordination question, and firstly, just to recognise the work of IFRC and the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway work. I thought it was outstanding. The question I have is really around the FRDP, which is a critical regional framework, and it brings together, of course, for the first time ever, an integrated approach to both climate and disaster risk reduction. And the Pacific led this way globally. And the establishment of the PRP, of course, is important to that execution. What I was most interested in is how is IFRC working at a national level and even at a community level to provide incentives for countries and communities to take up the FRDP, and how are you doing this with the legal framework and the legal tools that you're developing? I wonder if that makes sense. Thanks for the opportunity to ask it.
Hi, Gabby.
No, I was just unmuting actually to say I'll pass that one over to Meiapo. Meiapo, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Audrey, and thank you very much for your contribution to FRDP while you were with the Pacific community and working within the region. So thank you again. We go back to, I guess, the slide where we pointed out our engagement at the international, at the regional, and all the way down to community through the branches of the national societies. So in terms of implementation, this is actually where the actual integration does work down at the community level in terms of the different pieces of work or projects that are undertaken by the community. And I guess, you know, when you're talking about adaptation or when you're talking about mitigation, for instance, mangrove planting projects, this is something that's really kicking off in a number of local communities, and it's integrated to both climate change and DRR in the way it does mitigation and adaptation, disaster mitigation and climate change adaptation. In terms of the work that we're doing at the framework, we undertook a study on the coherence of disaster risk reduction and climate change back in 2019. And out of that case study, a further study was taken in relation to what the communities are doing with regards to implementation of climate change and DRR down at the community level. But in terms of the law formulation and different pieces of work that we support governments, we also support conversations and discussions within the different, as it's no secret that within the Pacific, when you're talking about climate change, it usually sits under a different division. When you're talking about disaster risk management, or DRR, it would sit under your National Emergency Management Office or your NDMO. But we facilitate the discussions between the two. And we support them jointly also, because in our slide earlier where we showed our presence in the region, you would have noticed that we also have a climate change facility. So we have a climate change delegate within the office who I have a lot of these discussions with on where both DRR and climate change can come together in terms of implementation and in terms of policy. And of course, integration does not necessarily mean it has to sit under one piece of legislation. Integration, I guess, mainly means that they're supposed to harmonize their approach so that they support each other in terms of implementation and in terms of law formulation. And so that's how we support this piece of work in terms of integration up at the regional level with FRDP in terms of all the conversations and discussions, especially with the new pillars that we have in place. at the national level with regards to discussions with government and various arms of government that deal with climate change and DRR. And down at community level, we support policies that impact the work that they are doing. So for instance, currently we've been asked to support some of the countries, one of the countries in the Pacific with their community-based disaster risk management policy. And this is an integrated approach in terms of risk management. So moving away from more focus on a disaster, but looking at disaster risk as well as climate risk. I hope that helps answers the question.
Thank you, Mea. Just aware, everyone, we have gone past the hour, and we do want to just make sure we've give time for a couple more questions. So if we will sort of wrap up soon, but we will continue for another 5 or 10 minutes. I do have another question here from Maureen and Valiami. And I think they may have had to leave the call, but it's in regard to mandating NGOs and civil society. Do you recommend including in do you recommend including IDRL in bills or acts or in regulation? Also, with regards to protection and inclusion, should this be in a bill, act, or regulation, or is it much of a muchness? Sorry, that's the question. I just wondered, Gabby or Mea, if you could comment on that.
Maybe I'll kick off on that one and then pass to Mea. Yeah, so in terms of the NGO question, it's certainly something, as I said, this area, it needs an all of society approach. It's not just an all of government approach. So certainly in our work, we are advocating that governments are looking at who needs to be around that table for their context. What we're finding is increasingly some of the NGO peak bodies like CID or, Piango, that they might be mandated to represent the wider NGO community. And that's a voice that we definitely think needs to be on the decision-making tables. So yes, that's the answer to that one. In terms of IDRL, whether it needs to sit in the main legislation or in regulation, what we're, I mean, again, it depends on the context and the lawmaking of that particular country. What we see in a lot of countries is that they might have some kind of reference in their act, but most countries like to keep their actual framework law quite general. But as long as there's kind of some mandated or inclusion in the overarching act, the greater detail can be put in the regulation. But what we need in terms of IDRL is it's not just left to a policy or an SOP, because a lot of those provisions need to bind and mandate other agencies like your customs or your immigration. So whether that's included in their acts or whether that's included in, it's going to depend on the context. Protection and inclusion, as much as we possibly, the detail that we can in the actual legislation is going to make it better. We find that, these kind of statements, these kind of wafty statements might be included in the law and regulation, and then, there might be some kind of policy sitting under it, which, it depends again on the context. If they make sure that policy will be given some force, that's okay. But, for contexts where you might need to have those provisions actually given a bit more binding force, we would recommend as much as possible to get some of that into, something that's binding, i.e. a regulation or a law. Mea, you might have some other thoughts on that one.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you for the question, Maureen and Liliami. Yes, a very important question. As pointed out by Gabby, it's always good to ensure that your roles and responsibilities, if you have a specific role within the legal framework or infrastructure for disaster response, preparedness, and recovery, it's always good to set it out either in the text of the main legislation or subsidiary legislation, which is the regulation. Some countries actually have that in place at the moment. So for one Pacific Island country that we're supporting, they're actually exploring not only having, say, the social services in there, but they're also looking at having civil society, looking at having the businesses involved as well to be part of their council, and ensuring that they are also represented not only at the national decision-making policy formulation, but down at the committees all the way down to the community level. And I guess, as pointed out, our experience from the Red Cross is that it really helps your formulation of response when you have actors down at the community level through the National Society branches who feed up information in terms of the vulnerabilities to support the planning of responses in future. And we feel that this is something that will also benefit any response within any country. But again, as pointed out by Gabby, at the end of the day, it is a sovereign decision of each country to make, whether they put it in their legislation or they put it in the regulations. But we do strongly advocate that it please be put out within the principal law, and if not, a strong piece of subsidiary law like the regulation, if possible, to ensure that these roles are enshrined and that future people will have no doubt as to the fact that they should be at the decision-making table as well as the planning table. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia, and thank you, Gabby. Josie, did you have a question you wanted to ask? Or
only if no one else has got one.
Well, we'll go to you for last question, and we can always follow up with questions after the presentation. Josie, if you want to ask your question. Yep.
Okay. So my question is to both of you, really, that this clearly is an agenda which is doing a fantastic job of narrowing that gap between development work and emergency responses. And we've worked a lot on that in CID of how we stop that slightly artificial divide of, you know, having a very good ambulance service, but not a very good hospital. So I wondered, you know, you've talked about things like building codes, you know, slow onset emergencies. These are all ways in which we can keep making the case for joining emergency responses and development. Is there anything else that we can do as members, but also as peak body organisations to, you know, to cross that nexus, to sort of get rid of that divide even more?
Yeah, great question. I think it's really important to make sure that you're part of those discussions as well. You know, I think quite often in the humanitarian world, we're framed as kind of humanitarian actors, and that we kind of stay in that emergency space. But I think, you know, what we're seeing in terms of climate and whatever now, it's a crisis. You know, it's now being framed in this kind of humanitarian language, and we're seeing actually, you know, that we also bring a lot of knowledge. We bring a lot of connection in this area as well, and that we have a role to play in all of those sectors. So I would be advocating that people get really familiar with the with the context they're working in, you know, to really understand what is that framework they're working in, and to make that connection, you know, and for you to also be that voice, you know, if you're at your disaster management, you know, work, or whether, you know, you're on climate changes, for you to be a voice like, how are you thinking about this? How are you making that connection? You know, it's really important that people are reminded that those connections needed to be made as well, and that you're also empowering your partners across the Pacific, that they also get involved in that decision making and ask those questions as well. Meiapo.
Thank you very much, Josie. And I think this reminds me of an issue that we had with one of the countries where we were trying to support the expedited clearance without duty of their consignments. And we had a meeting with the authorities. And before we went in, the coalition of the National Society and a number of NGOs and CSOs were like worried because they never really mentioned this issue or approached government on this issue before. But when we got there, we just did a simple presentation, explained what the goods was for and how it will support government. And without any questions, government just said, oh, we're happy to support. And one of the key things that came out of the discussions afterwards was because of the wonderful work all these actors had been doing, so the services they had been providing, without even asking for this particular advantage or this particular concession in the past, government had seen the demonstration of their relevance and the good work that they were doing within the country, supporting them in times of response. So I guess that brings me to the end of the story, which is basically continue doing the wonderful work you are doing, demonstrating the type of support that you can bring to government. And when you do have that discussion later on in the future, your work will speak for itself, and government will really allow you access and allow you the support that you need in order to strengthen you in the responses and the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Meiapo,
Gab.
and
Yeah,
thank you, Gabby. Look, we'll wrap up, but it's been a really important talk and discussion to be having this afternoon. And one of the things that I've taken away from it is just how comprehensive the engagement on IDRL needs to be, you know, whether it's Crown Research Institutes or whether it's academia or private businesses. You know, and being involved in right from disaster response, right back through to preparedness as well. So thank you so much for the presentation. With these things, I always feel like the conversation is just beginning. So I'd like to thank you, Gabby, and look forward to welcoming you back onto New Zealand soil very soon. And Mea, I look forward to meeting you once we're on the same side of a border somewhere. So thank you again, and thank you everyone else for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.